Hi, everybody. I wanted to tune in and just talk a little bit about what I've been working on lately in my practice. So, as a lot of you know, so much of my practice is about ancestor work. It's something that I write about a lot and I talk about a lot. And this really interesting thing happens to me this week. So, last week, I got really excited about going more into my Czech culture. So Czech is on my paternal side. And for the past year or so, I've been leaning more towards my maternal ancestry, which is Welsh. And I was getting a little discouraged because there's a lot of overlap with Welsh and Celtic religions, and there's a lot of overlap between what is really Irish and what is really British and what is really Welsh. And so I've had to kind of release my essentially really Western boundary border type mindset in order to really surrender to like I had just so much resentment around Roman rulership and colonization. And that was kind of the energy was really in my body. So I've been kind of clearing some of that energy, gaining new perspective about some of those relationships and how it has affected my heritage, the way that, the Welsh and the British are seen is different in our culture now, but it just seems like in, ancient and pre-ancient times that it wasn't really necessarily that way. And as someone who wants to acknowledge the land that I live on, I think about a lot what was the land like for people in my ancestry? What did it mean for people like me then to be indigenous? And there's some really interesting information about that I've been coming across, particularly around the culture of, the British Isles and tattoos, which was really fascinating. So I've been kind of, moving in that direction. But then last week I just got this really um internal pull to look at my paternal side. I've lost my father. I am not that close with that side of the family. Um, and the Czech heritage in my paternal lineage is really potent. It's my great grandmother spoke Czech, my grandparents speak a little. There's family reunions. We're in a town that was settled by our own family, so it has colonizing vibes, which is why I haven't really gone down that rabbit hole. There's some, as I study indigenous American culture on Turtle Island, it's hard for me to, I guess, relate as much to that that side of the family. But part of the work has to include having a relationship with that. Like I can't just ignore that. So that's kind of what has been coming up. Native American Heritage Day was just this Monday, and I listened to a podcast, the Behind the Bastards, so good, about Columbus recently, and I feel such a deep attachment to South America as well. Like I wouldn't say attachment, like that's not my culture. I feel like a deep resonance with South America and the way that colonization, like the first and the longest, and it just hearing those stories, I'm emotional about it. I think a lot of white people should be emotional about it. And so all of that was kind of making this soup that was like, okay, let's look at my Czech heritage. And so when I start a line of thinking magically, I don't really dive into the research right away. My Mercury is in Libra, so I do love my research. I have a Virgo sun, so I'm very mercurial. I like doing the reading and I like doing the study. But what I have noticed is that usually because a lot of the content about race and colonization is so propagandized, and I mean, even from the early days of colonization, the history is written by the victors. Like, even my British culture, which now is a colonizing culture that learned the playbook from the Romans, like, we were seen as stupid and savage and not intelligent, even though some of the most powerful magic that we know of today, like the most mainstream, I won't say powerful, but like pervasive is really what I mean, is like this really rich Celtic, like, which is kind of cringe. Like, it's actually like one of the barriers to me studying my religion is how cringe it's become, because of like what was going on in the 90s with like white women with dreads and all of that stuff. So, anyway, so I, instead of just diving right into the research, I started just opening my psyche up to whatever communications my ancestors have with me, because my ancestors are really the first point of contact for information about my own heritage. And then what I end up doing is, after I've kind of asked the question of like, or opened the door for my ancestors to come through, then normally they send me stuff to study. So what they sent me this week was, or last week actually, I was watching this TikToker that I love, who I cannot remember her name because I am the worst at that. But she talks a lot about Slavic folklore, and I never considered myself Slavic because I didn't really understand. I knew the history of like Czechoslovakia and the Slavic nations becoming unified or whatever a little bit, just from my family stories, but I just never really defined myself that way. It never seemed right. And then there's also like this rich vein of bohemian that runs through me. And it's starting to become clear that, through my meditation, that the Slavic and the bohemian are really intertwined. And there's a lot of like crossover between those sides of my ancient family. Probably not anything super recent. But so those are the things that are coming through as like downloads, right? And then I'm like, oh, I never really thought about the fact that I might be Slavic. Like, I was always just like, check, 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 which is kind of like how when I was looking up my Welsh heritage, I was like, oh, I never really thought of myself as Celtic because I was like Welsh, 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 right? But the energy is just so different than what we like, than I'll say what I can perceive, because I have this identity that is like ingrained in me by the colonization that we live in, like by the structures that we live in, that these country names and these borders say more about our heritage than the people that we actually come from, right? So, that's just like this massive umbrella of like unpacking what borders mean and what heritage means. And I think that like diving into that can be really uncomfortable because there are so many ways that I, as a white woman, can subconsciously perpetuate that. So that's kind of what was going on last week. And then this week, I listened to, I love my podcasts, Getting Curious with Jonathan Van Ness. They are like this amazing creator who interviews the best of the best when it comes to historians and scientists. And I love that podcast so much. So there was an episode about race in the ancient world. And of course, they brought up my arch nemesis, the Romans. And they talked about like the Romans and the Greeks, and there wasn't a whole lot of content about like my heritage in particular, but it was really kind of echoing the things that I had been feeling about how borders and boundaries have really, been limiting for how I can think about my heritage, because it's like not like, it's kind of a recent development that we think about race and heritage as something that is the color of our skin. I don't want to like imply that like my whiteness isn't a part of my identity, because in I live in the United States, and in the United States, like, we have a problem with anti-blackness, and the concept of whiteness is what creates that anti-blackness. And that didn't start until like very recent in our recorded history. And they were talking about the ways that, slavery impacted how, like, the culture worked, how slavery was kind of an indicator of labor, and how race wasn't a part of slavery then, which is something that I kind of knew because of the research that I've done around slavery, that like chattel slavery and race based slavery started with like this Puerto Rican slave situation. And then we can't not hold Columbus accountable for the fact that he went to these brown people and just assigned them slaves. And all of that. Highly recommend the Columbus episodes of Behind the Bastards if you haven't listened to them yet. Very insightful. But the last week I had just like conceptualized that, oh, like Slavic is a huge part of my identity. And I'm listening to this fucking podcast and I find out that the word slave comes from Slavic because of like some of the early like recorded instances of slavery being the Slavic people. And what it really did was open my eyes to the fact that, I don't think of myself as having like a recent and still ongoing relationship with ancestors that were slaves, right? I don't learn about my heritage of slavery through a racist lens every day. It's definitely not the fucking same as, the situation with Black slavery in America and how the stories of that are used as violence against Black people every day. But the way that like it just like clicked like a light bulb in my head, this other phrase that they said when they were on the podcast is like Romans had a different relationship to slavery because they like released slaves often, and it was like a political negotiation of like, oh well, maybe one day you'll get out of slavery. It wasn't always like a permanent thing. And it just it resonated so deeply with me to look back at how dynamic and how like old this tradition is of people using other people, like hijacking their free will. It's something that still happens today. And the things that have been coming up for me around that are like, I can't even like articulate it quite yet, but it's like this feeling of like, oh, well, under capitalism, we are slaves, right? And we look at it as wage slavery, which is totally true, but it got me in the mind of an elite person who believes that they are better than people that are in the lower class. Like, to them there is no like humanity in our labor. Like, it is slave labor because they feel entitled to that. They feel entitled to slavery. And then the other part of it is just having like, they said, like putting on your ancient goggles, which is something that I didn't really realize that my research does for me, like actually going back and feeling what it was like to be an ancestor and putting together my own history. That's like a massive privilege because not a lot of people who have undergone colonization can even go back and see what their history was like, because one of the aspects of colonization is an erasure of heritage and history. Like with the boarding schools for indigenous people, it's a part of it is removing the history. And I just, I don't want to squander that privilege, and I'm really looking forward to going back into like more of my Slavic DNA and doing meditations around that and just accessing more of the magic that I have available to me. So that's the little story. Just the synchronicity of being like, oh, I might be Slavic, and then finding out like that, just like one nugget, like I'm still like, okay, what are my ancestors trying to tell me? Is there a specific ancestor that's trying to contact me? Because as someone who does like, I do a lot of like timeline stuff, like reaching into the past and the future. It's like usually when I get these pieces of information, it's either an ancestor, or I'm not really sure if past life is the right word, because I think that past lives are actually a part of our DNA history, but that's a story for another day. Like, I'm just like feeling like, oh, is there this Slavic ancestor who's really trying to tell me about their story specifically? Like, is there, oh, the thing about timelines is that usually the ancestors in my lineage that do magic, they know who I am. And so they, like, I'm like seeing this person. If you've heard the story of how I discovered that I was psychic, it's because my ancestors were dancing around a fire, and because I was doing magic at the same like at frequency or whatever, they saw me in the smoke of the fire and they were like, oh my gosh, that's our descendant. And I was like visiting them, like kind of like a deity. Like they conceptualized it kind of different than like a god, but it's like a spirit, like a really like potent spirit that's like on the same vibration. So they saw me in the fire, and that's how like I was able to connect with them because we were both doing magic. So what I'm imagining, like I definitely need more data before I can say this, is that there is a Slavic ancestor who's in like this tough situation. I can like feel what they're feeling when I talk about it. And they're doing this magic that is like things are going to be better for my lineage. Like it's like something that they're doing, and they're like trying to tell me that like something that they did worked or something. And we all have blessings from people in our lineage that wanted, legacy was such a huge part of procreation then. I mean, I'm sure it is now. I don't really subscribe to the content of legacy because I have ancestors that I have no DNA connection to, and I don't plan on having children, so I will have descendants that I have no DNA connection to. But yeah, I look forward to kind of unpacking that and probably having, I'm about to be in nature soon. If you follow my vlog on my other channel, you know that I'm doing this van life thing and I'm about to be in the woods for a long time. And I look forward to connecting with this ancestor or ancestors that are sending me this information and learning more about their story. So that's what's going on with me. And drop your questions in the comments. I'm back on the channel now, so if you want to see or hear anything specific about witchcraft, sex magic, doing ancestor work as a white person, those are all things that I'm really passionate about. So I could talk for days. Okay, bye.